I'll call the meeting of the Planning and Zoning Commission of October 20th order. Roll call, Mike Allen is excused, I guess. John Baylor, absent. David Cobb, present. And Douglas Dunn here, Sandy Hoopers here. Nancy Piranha, not here. Mike here. I did talk with Mel, and he indicated that he was probably not going to be here tonight. Just call the public, there's nobody out there, so we'll move on to agenda item 1, which is possible recommendation of the mayor and council. Consideration of changes to 2.6.9 procedure to the transfer of city property. And does the city attorney want to make some comments here, or?
Sure, I would love to. Appreciate it. Commission, this is Joe Estes. I'm the city attorney for the city of Bisbee. And the reason this is before the commission tonight is because a while back, the city was getting inundated with requests from individuals to purchase slivers of property, small pieces of property, sections of property. And it was really bogging down the system, and we really didn't have a good system to account for when individuals come to the city to request to purchase property. So the mayor and council asked that I look at this section and propose some revisions to it to make it a little more fair, a little more equitable, and to address the issues that were ongoing with the city. Some of those were, for example, it would be the burden of the individual who's asking to purchase the property from the city to obtain any necessary surveys or appraisals, because all of that cost was being pushed back on the city in the past. And it really wasn't fair that the city and the taxpayers would bear the burden to pay those expenses for individuals that were looking to purchase property from the city for their own personal purposes. So what I did is I put together and revised the list of procedures for the transfer of real property to identify the those things that the mayor and council wanted to have in there with regard to the duties and obligations of the individual who's seeking to purchase the property from the city. And that's what you see in the essentially in the first few sections. A lot of the second part of it with regard to coming before the Planning and Zoning Commission, and that procedure hasn't changed. It's still a process where it will go before P&Z for review and recommendation to council, and then council would ultimately have the final say on that. And we increased the value of the appraised value of property without it having to go to technically into an auction if certain conditions were met with regard to the size and location of the property and whether or not it benefited any other surrounding parcel owners. Because it doesn't make sense to, if you have a sliver of property that's only adjacent to one individual, to put something like that up for a public auction and then ultimately have a third party purchase it and then have to have access through someone else's private property just to access a sliver of property that was sold. So has the commission had an opportunity to go through this, and do you have any questions with regard to any of the provisions?
Any questions or comments from the commission?
I had a question. Let me see if I can find it here.
Well, that's one probably.
Yeah.
On the first page, it says an appraisal of property completed by a certified general appraiser licensed in Arizona. For as long as I've been on the board, almost 2 years now, there was a certain real estate agent that was doing the appraisals. I forget what her name is.
And those technically weren't appraisals, those were essentially broker price opinions. Those were opinions of a real estate agent. And technically what we need to have in order to establish value, we need to have an appraisal. An appraisal is different than a real estate agent's opinion of
Correct.
value. So that's the reason for for that change.
Okay, well, that appraisal should be included and included with the application. And paid for by the proposal, right?
Right, you'll see that there's an initial process first to submit the proposal to the city. And then once it's been acknowledged that all the required information is there, then the process is then they would provide the appraisals and stuff, because it really wouldn't be fair to have somebody submit an application, get an appraisal, a survey, and then submit it, and then have it come back and say, no, this is a piece of property that the city has anticipated to use for something else or has a specific purpose. So we want an initial review process to determine, yes, this is something that we can move forward with. And then once we do that, then yes, before it goes to P and Z, the application would have to include the appraisal and the survey if necessary. The survey is only necessary if they're doing, say, for example, a less than a full parcel, identified parcel with the county assessor's office. So if they're asking for a sliver of a parcel, you know, say they want 10 feet or 20 feet of the specific parcel, it would be their obligation to go and to obtain a survey and get the legal description for the property that they're asking to purchase.
Okay. I didn't see, we had talked in our meetings about that there was a minimum price per square foot. Where they were talking about, it was some scuttlebutt I heard someplace. I didn't see anywhere in this proposal where there's a minimum price per square foot. Or a minimum dollar amount per parcel.
Correct. There wouldn't be a minimum price per square foot because it would be the appraised value. And ultimately, it is the mayor and council, even with that appraised value, the mayor and council are still responsible for setting the minimum bid requirement for those parcels that do go to bid. So what there is there is you'll see in section E is where any parcel has an appraised value of less than $7,000. Then there's a process for that to be able to go to council without having to go through a public auction process. But that requires number one and number two to be met, that there's no other adjoining property owner that can, within the zoning code, lawfully utilize that property. And there's no adjacent property owner who desires to purchase the property. Or, for example, there's arguments where the property has historically been used by a certain property owner, and they're just coming in to clean up the title because they've been using it, say, for 20 or 30 years as a driveway or something. And in order to sell their property, they have to make sure that, you know, all their usages are cleaned up and that they have appropriate legal usage and stuff.
Was there any discussion around the $7,000 number of increasing that based on the fact that prices have increased quite a bit lately?
So no, there wasn't a lot of discussion with regard to that value. It was just the prior value was $5,000, and that was established back, I think, in 2015. So I just adjusted it for time and inflation to 7,000. But if the commission wants to recommend a higher or lower number, it's up to you. If you know, nobody.
The old number was kind of low. 7,000 is fine as far as I'm concerned.
So, and again, the purpose for that is just to address, a lot of times we get people who come to the city and they want to purchase, you know, 700 square feet of an adjoining parcel that has historically they've used for either parking or for a driveway or something. And one, it doesn't make sense to require that to go to a public auction. So typically in those circumstances, the value of that small amount of property would typically be under $7,000.
Thank you.
Sandy?
One follow-up on that, under F. Number 2, where it says no adjoining property owner who desires to purchase. Is that assuming that when you do the public notice, nobody comes forward? Or are they actually contacted, or is it just nobody coming forward?
Yeah, we would assume that when we do the public notices and the notices, I believe there's a notice requirement for adjacent property owners.
300 feet.
Yeah, so there is a notice requirement. So the assumption is that if they received proper notice and they didn't speak up, then they don't have an interest. We don't want to make it too onerous where you have to go and get people to sign off and say, no, I'm not interested. So the assumption is always, if, you know, just like any other notice requirement for zoning and stuff, if the adjoining property owners remain silent, then that is their, you know, essentially their acquiescence to the change.
Okay, and regarding the fees, so I'm assuming all of these fees require to all the requests, even the ones under 7,000, that they'll pay the application fee, the survey, and the appraisal fee. What do appraisal fees typically run?
For a full residential appraisal, I know here in the Phoenix Valley, you're usually around $500 or $600 for an appraisal.
Okay.
But
Is
those are, the only fee that would be paid to the city would be the application fee.
right.
We're in the process of trying to establish what that fee would be, because essentially what that fee is intended to cover is the administrative cost of city staff to process and to review and oversee the process of the application. And we will be doing a fee adjustment to the city's fee schedule to include this fee sometime in December, because we have another ordinance change that's going to require a change to the fee schedule. So we're going to do it all at one time.
Is there a preconceived notion of what that dollar amount's going to be?
I haven't received anything back yet. You know, typically we look at about $50 an hour, depending on how many hours it's anticipated staff would have to, you know, to incur to run these purchases through the process. I mean, you don't want to make it onerous. But you want to make it reasonable. So again, you're not putting burden of administrative costs on the taxpayers for somebody coming in and wanting to purchase a piece of property from the city. And again, these are pieces of property that the city's not actively out there marketing to sell. These are typically what we're seeing are individuals that are coming to the city that say, for example, they want additional space for a park space, or they need to clean up something that has been a historical use. These are times and issues where individuals are coming in asking the city to do something that the city hasn't, you know, isn't actively out there marketing. It's not like, for example, with the Hillcrest property where the city issued an RFP and said, please submit your bids and proposals for the purchase of this property.
Sandy, you have anything else?
No, I'm just trying to,
Well, then I'll ask some questions.
well, I'm trying to justify if somebody comes in wanting to buy a piece of property and they pay the application and they pay to have it surveyed and they pay the appraisal, and then it goes to public auction and someone else buys it. I guess they're just out that money. I can't think of any way to recoup that for them.
And that's the whole purpose behind, you know, that would have an impact on probably what they would be willing to bid on the property because they've expended this money on that parcel. And again, that really only comes down to certain circumstances where you have a piece of property that is pretty much a standalone piece of property. You know,
Right, yeah. Okay.
I had a couple of questions, not directly related to this, but it's associated with this, and it's coming from our board. In the city boundaries. Bisbee city boundaries, there's 3 types of non-owned properties. There's not personally owned, there's
Right.
city Bisbee property. And then there's what we were told was public property. You go down to the assessor's office and there'll be a section of land that is not owned by the city. Is there some ordinance that I'm not aware of that places that under the city?
no, the only way the city can obtain and own property is by way of ordinance. And we've had this issue come up before because there's, especially in Old Bisbee, there's always issues with regard to whether or not these stairs are public or private property, whose responsibility for these access areas are, for these retaining walls, different walkways and things like that. There is this last year, we did come across a quit claim deed from Freeport that cleared up a substantial amount of those issues and concerns. But technically, if the property isn't owned by the city, then it would either be state property or federal property. There really isn't a category of, you know, a kind of a no man's land property where it's just quote unquote government property. It would
We
have,
had one come up about 2 years ago with Todd Coughlin
okay,
on Brewery Gulch, and he wanted to buy a piece of land, and it wasn't owned by anybody. It was just there. You know, some of these surveys go way, way, way back. And it was just there, and there was a discussion about whether or not the city could sell property it didn't technically own. It was, Joe Ward used to call it people's land or public land. It was owned by the general public, and it wasn't owned by the city. And I was just curious if we need to clean that, or you need to clean that up a little bit, that anything within the city boundaries, you know, that's not owned by somebody or deeded to somebody belongs to the city.
yeah, the only issue there,
Parcels like that.
yeah, the issue there is that the city ends up taking on substantial additional liability for those properties, depending on where they are, you know, if they even have access. The issue there is the fact that the county documents, the county recorder doesn't have sufficient information to be able to trace back the ownership of that property. You know, my position would be is if they can't trace back the ownership, then it would be state property.
How would somebody in the city of Bisbee go about buying that property?
Well, it would be up to the mayor and council if they wanted to purchase that. Are you talking if the city was to purchase it or someone within?
Just an individual, I'm talking about these little slivers of property, you know, that people want to park on, and it's not owned by the city, it's public. We use the word public land, and it's public land, we just want park there.
You know, we would have to address those on a case-by-case basis, because if technically, if the city doesn't own the property, then the city doesn't have the ability to sell it. You wouldn't be able to give marketable title to somebody. They would have to go through a process of, you know, the title company would have to do a very detailed title search to try to go back and figure out where that fell through the cracks, why it's not associated with some other property, because all of that property would have to be associated with some ownership somewhere back in history.
Okay.
And that's why if there is no documentation with regard to ownership, that's why it would revert back and be considered state property back to when the state incorporated and became a state.
Okay. The last question I have, and maybe beyond the scope of this committee, I've done a lot of land research for little parcels and stuff. And there's a lot of property in city of Bisbee that's deeded to Phelps Dodge.
Yes,
Phelps Dodge is no longer existent.
they have successors.
Quit claim all the Phelps Dodge property to Freeport McMillan.
Yeah, they would have a successor in interest if Freeport McMillan purchased all of Phelps Dodge assets, then essentially those would be Freeport McMillan property.
Let me explain my question a little bit more. Behind the post office, between the highway and the post office, and whatever that street is,
Commerce.
between Commerce and the highway is all Phelps Dodge land. And we have a lot of transient problems there. And the police department refuses to remove the vagrants from them because it's private property. That's why I was asking, that's the reason why I'm asking about the Phelps Dodge land is really Freeport McMillan land. So we would need to get Freeport McMillan to trespass these vagrants off of their property.
Yes, and they could do that very simply by putting a no trespass, no loitering sign, and then the city could enforce that. And actually, that's much more. I would tell you from an attorney's perspective, that's much more preferable than the city owning it, because there are a number of Ninth Circuit cases that have come out in the last 5 to 6 years with regard to homeless encampments, where they have found that these cities do not have the ability to stop or to remove these homeless encampments if there aren't sufficient homeless shelter beds available.
I'm aware of that decision.
Yeah. So, but that doesn't apply to private property. And if we have private property and we have a notice from Freeport that there's no trespassing, no loitering on that property, then it's much easier for the city to enforce that than if it were city property. The city really wouldn't have the ability to remove those individuals if they claim that they were homeless and there weren't sufficient homeless shelter beds available for them.
Mr. Estes, thank you for letting me go off topic.
No, it's definitely related to city property and to what we're trying to accomplish here, where we're trying to, we've got over 100 years of complicated property transfers and lack of documentation. And that's the reason why we're getting a lot of these applications to purchase properties, because we've got a lot of these slivers and these pieces of property that nobody really knows what to do with.
Yes, I live up on Quality Hill in a house that was built in 1884. Off of leased land from Phelps Dodge that was not titled to the property until 1985. Talking about a mess.
Yes.
Phelps Dodge survey was not an accurate survey. It was off by 2 or 3 feet.
Back then, it was just, especially when in the late 1800s, early 1900s, it was, how quickly can we get individuals into these miner shacks so we can get them working and mining the mine. They weren't really concerned with surveys and property lines and all of that.
I'm going to pass this back to Douglas.
Other comments, questions from council members? Get back to that point of this land that's you referred to, mine referred to as public land. My understanding was that that Phelps Dodge in some cases had quote deeded property to the city, but the city had never accepted it. Is that a correct assessment of these properties that have kind of unclear title?
That could be, like I said, we did come across a quitclaim deed that was accepted by the city 20 or 30 years ago. We did come across that earlier this year, and that has helped clean up a lot of these issues with regard
Okay.
to stairs and pathways and things. But essentially, yes, you know, just because somebody wants to quit claim over property to the city, a quit claim deed alone doesn't accomplish that. By the charter, the city has to acquire or transfer property by way of ordinance. And so that way we have a legislative action that we can track into perpetuity, supposedly. So we can go back and we can verify when the city agreed to accept ownership of that property, because again, accepting ownership of property also accepts the liability for the ownership of that property.
Does NINA have access to that quick claim deed?
Yeah, Nina, if we can email that out to all the commission, so they
Okay.
can- that's the one that that was circulated around earlier this year. I think it's about 16 pages long.
Okay,
And that has not yet been accepted by the city?
No, it has. It was done by ordinance back, I want to say Nina was at in like early 1990s.
yeah, I want to say so.
Could we get
It was just something that that administration, that city staff wasn't aware of.
Yep.
So,
Okay.
yeah, we can share that with you, and you know, it's a public record, and that way everybody hopefully kind of clears up some of these areas of questionable title history.
Any further questions or comments from commission members? Thank you. Then, do we have a motion?
I'll make the motion. I move the Planning and Zoning Commission recommend to mayor and city council the proposed changes to 2.6.9. Procedures for the transfer of city property.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
Okay. I'll do a roll call then. David Cobb,
Yes.
Douglas Dunn, yes. Randy Huesman,
Yes,
Michael Spencer.
Yes.
Okay, that's passed. Thank you, sir.
All right, thank you, commissioners.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nina. I will go ahead and log off so you guys can finish up your evening. Have a great evening, everybody.
All right, thank you.
Move on to agenda item.
Well, he's quite knowledgeable. I have to sit there and say, he is quite knowledgeable and he answered every single one of my questions, just like NINA does.
Well, I appreciate that.
Oh, it took up a lot of things and a lot of things we can do. Okay, I'm off subject here, but there's a huge problem with vagrants.
Yeah,
And it's getting worse now that the weather is getting cold in other places. We own a hotel right down on Brewery Gulch, and then I live up on Quality Hill. And there's a number of public parcels that people are starting to build encampments up on Quality Hill. And all the way down that highway. Quality Hill used to go Quality Hill Road used to go all the way down adjacent to the highway, all the way down to where the burger stand used to be. It got washed out when they built the highway,
oh,
but that was a very famous road. And just, I'm looking at tourists, you know, we're the tourists.
well, I'm sure you probably could call Logan.
Pardon?
I'm sure next week call Logan and maybe he can put in a request to Freeport to put up signs in that area.
Logan or Matt?
Logan, because Logan works Monday through Thursday, so he won't be there tomorrow. So call him next week.
Okay, so a clarification again for me.
Uh-huh.
What's the hierarchy?
Matt is the Public Works Director and Logan is the Operations Manager
Okay,
of Public Works.
okay. I heard from some city employees that they switched back and forth, who was boss this week?
Well, if nobody is like, if Matt's on vacation, then it's Logan. If they're
Okay.
both there, it's Matt and Logan together, or it's just Matt.
Okay,
It just depends on what aspect. Is it operational or is it the whole department?
Go on to agenda item 2. Possible recommendations to mayor and council request that planning and zoning commission amend zoning code 6.3.1 D. Regarding setbacks of buildings from the current 3 feet to 5 feet. The reason being, is the additional spacing would limit the chain reaction from fires. And 2, the change would still adhere to the current building code. All public notices have been met. Is there a staff report on this?
No, I was just gonna, what I put on there was what Joe gave me.
Okay.
And Joe is not in this week.
It's pretty well straightforward.
Yes, sir.
I'll declare the public meeting open. No one here. So. I'll close it. Is there any discussion from council on this item?
Yeah, I'm a little unclear on this one. Because he's calling it outbuildings. In the zoning, outbuilding would be a new structure,
It's actually, it's the accessory building.
accessory building.
Yeah,
that-
it's addressed in D. I think this was attached, was this not attached to yours?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yes, it was.
so that's what so he basically just wants to change this, so for the, he said because of chain reaction fires, that way it would give a little
I
bit,
agree with this, but I thought this was a conflict. Again, we'll talk about my own personal experience. And if we have a property that has a number of structures, foundations, old foundations that are on the property line. And in the historic Bisbee district, supposedly you can rebuild on the old foundation.
now that you can, this is for,
New structures.
correct. But, and the other one that was changed that you did last year, it said it could use the same footprint. If that was destroyed by fire or something else, I can't remember, act of God, I don't know what it was, but it could use this,
Old foundations.
right, it could use the same
Okay, but
footprint.
You have the same piece of property that's got foundations on it. You know,
It's kind of ironic that you can rebuild if your home was destroyed by fire
Mhm,
without having a setback that would keep your home from being destroyed by fire.
I know,
the only problem with that is, and I just remember now, Joe says you have to go with current building code,
Mhm.
which means if you have a 0 lot line. You have to put a firewall up.
right,
You can't use a level, you cannot rebuild the structure the way it is, you have to go to current code.
right,
But if you have a setback, you don't need a firewall.
yes,
But the city won't let you have a setback because you need to be in the footprint.
No.
just for the historic district. Yeah, in the other
Because
places,
it's technically a rebuild rather than a.
correct, you're using the same footprint, whatever, what was there to begin with, regardless of whether it was an accessory building or whatever, you're gonna use the same footprint that it had when it was originally there before it was destroyed by fire.
You have that choice, basically.
Mhm.
It's
Yep.
not Required.
You can look up Brewery Gulch, and there's all those old
Mhm.
partial foundations sitting up there.
Yeah,
Or those mostly burned down, but they're you.
well, my understanding is if you don't have that foundation there, then it's very complicated to get a permit for a new build. That foundation is your way into a building, correct?
No, not necessarily. As long as you can plot out, if I'm understanding you correctly, in Old Bisbee, as long as you can plot out, like do a location map from that to say where it's going to be. Let's say like, there was one we just did. Oh, I can't even think of the name of the street. I'm gonna say OK Street because I don't think that's it. But the home was destroyed by fire. And she is asked to go outside of that footprint. Because the way the lot is made with that original footprint, she can't put the house back the way it was because of the retaining wall. So there are certain circumstances, if it can't be rebuilt on that footprint, that as long as you have plans and you specifically go out and you go through the design review board, then
It's
you,
just a different process.
Correct.
You need to prove for.
right,
Gotcha.
right. But her property was shaped funny. And so putting it back the way it was, the retaining wall behind it was a problem.
Every property is shaped funny.
I know,
There's a square building in this town.
I know.
And certainly in terms of the property or structure being grandfathered in, there's no time limit on a grandfathered in. I mean, if it's
Not that I,
the foundation there, I always thought that there was a time. limit.
you know, I don't know that, Mr. Dunn. I just don't,
We didn't put the time on.
I don't think we did, and I don't think we use the word grandfather. I can look, but I don't believe we use those terms.
I asked the question because the foundation that they did not, was burned down in 1912. So it's 110-year-old
Right,
foundation. You can only find two sides of it.
right.
It's the one right above your house.
Well, I'm assuming that the foundation doesn't actually be here, the need to be present, it just needs to have been there,
Mhm.
correct?
I believe so. Yep,
Which is,
right,
you just have to make sure it's a firewall.
right. You just have to make sure you have that,
I agree with this. I have no issues with this.
yeah.
Do we have a motion?
I'll make the motion. I move the planning and zoning commission recommend to mayor and city council the amendment of zoning code 6.3.1.
In a second,
I'll second.
okay? I'll do a roll call. David Cobb,
Yes,
Douglas Dunn, yes. Sandy Hoosman,
Yes,
and Michael Smith.
Yes.
Okay, and it's been passed. Okay, staff.
I do have something
Okay.
that I'd like to ask, not really a comment. I have some changes for the design review board standards. Well, they used to call them guidelines. Now they're going to change the name to standards, and they have changed a lot of the code to go along with their new standards. And I need to know if I'll have a quorum for November 17th so that I can do a public hearing for that. I know Sandy said she's not going to be available, but if you could just email me and let me know if you're not going to be available. And I'll get with the other members that aren't present to see if I'll have a quorum to do the public hearing. Because if not, we may have to wait till the beginning of the year. Because I know December's also hard to get a quorum sometimes. But they want to change their guidelines for the historic district. And so they have spent 6 years. And the last 3 years, they've really focused on it. So it has to come before the planning and zoning before it can go to mayor and council.
Is the next meeting really November 1st?
It's November 17th. The 7 got mixed. The 7 got left out. You know, I do multiple agendas at the time, so one of them probably had a date that had 3 digits. But it's the 17th. So if you're not able to make it, if you could just give me an email after or later on next week or so, because I need to do the requirements for posting and everything.
Okay.
Okay,
I'll be here.
okay, okay. All righty, so I just need to make sure one of the other 2 are here and then we'll be good. Yeah, and it is a long process. That's why I'm trying to get it out early, because it's a very long document and it's a lot of codes that are changing. That they want to change.
Good. Other commissioner comments in terms of future agenda items? Are we ready to adjourn?
I move we adjourn.
We are adjourned.
You know, we did a piece of property that we were trying to purchase.